You know, the Bible's a weird book. It's amazing what people will find in this book if they look hard enough. If they look hard enough, you can find biblical support for spaceships, extraterrestrials, Jesus as a guru, Eastern religions, divorce for any reason, reincarnation. People find all of these things in the Bible. Every cult uses the Bible. Much of the occult uses the Bible. It's not surprising that people will find some surprising things there then. Let me give you another example of what I would consider a surprising thing that people find in the Bible. Jane Chastain is a friend and colleague of mine over at KBRT. Many of you listen to her commentaries during the week. She has a teenage son who's a senior in high school. She sent him to a Christian school, a private Christian school in North Hollywood. The school covers K through 12. And he came home one day and told her about how his senior humanities class was being opened up to a special speaker. The speaker was going to talk on the topic of homosexuality, and especially on the topic of homosexuality in the Bible. Now, please keep in mind, this is not a public school. This is one of the finest Christian schools in Los Angeles. As a matter of fact, Christian celebrities, I guess we can use that term. Unfortunately, that is used to describe some of those people, have their children that go to this school. And Blaine, Jane's son, mentioned that this individual was going to speak, and Jane had sought unsuccessfully an opportunity to address members of the school, students in the school, on this issue because it had been addressed in a fairly liberal fashion in the past. She wanted to be able to reply to it. They had told her, well, we'll get around to it. We'll see. We'll have you on maybe, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden she finds out that there is another speaker being invited to come in, but it didn't look like someone who would give a conservative perspective. So it was more of the same and not a balanced viewpoint. She asked permission to be able to go to the school and visit and attend this lecture. She was denied. And so she had her son smuggle in a tape recorder and then smuggle out the handouts for that so she could find out what it was that took place. And when she listened to the tape and she read the handouts, she was appalled because these students, and not only the senior humanities class, but the entire senior class, because the class was opened up to this speaker, were addressed by what turned out to be, in Jane's terms, a homosexual activist who said that homosexuality was normal, moral, and biblical. And then went on to explain from Bible texts why the Bible does not condemn homosexuality and why the texts that have been classically used to do so have been misunderstood for the last 2,000 years, or longer in some cases. Now, the most tragic aspect of this entire situation was the response of the Christian parents that had children in the schools, because knowing who Jane was, a person who really specialized in this kind of thing, these moral, cultural, social issues, and speaking out on them. She's a regular on CNN and dealing with these ethical issues. And these parents came to her looking for some answers. And the questions they asked her were, gee, Jane, does the Bible say anything about homosexuality? Keep in mind that these are Christian parents that are in church every Sunday. And as a response to that, Jane went ahead and did a series of commentaries on homosexuality on the air, precisely because there seemed to be such a paucity of good information, biblical information in the church on this issue, and there's been a lot of confusion. And as I heard that, I realized that maybe our church needs a little bit more teaching on this from the Scriptures, so that we have a clear idea of what the Scriptures have to say. So today we're going to do a little Bible study. That's all, just a simple Bible study. We're going to go to the text and we're going to take a close look at the text and find out what the text says. Now, I have to say something in starting out so that there's absolutely no misunderstanding about what's going on here. I am not here to malign, to browbeat, to bash or name call or demean or offend or attack or belittle or to heap special condemnation on any group of people. That is not my desire whatsoever, and I will not do that. What I want to do is to determine one thing and one thing only: what is the most reasonable, what is the most sensible, what is the most fair conclusion about what the Bible teaches on homosexuality. Simply put, I want to set the record straight, because there's a lot of interpretations that are flying about. And what I'd like to do is go back to the specific texts and look at them. I will read the texts to you, and then I will read from the handouts that were given in this senior humanities seminar as to what the particular, if I could put it this way, theological homosexual interpretation are of those passages, and then I will do my own assessment. I will read from handouts put together by Dr. Thomas Hart, who's a PhD, and I'm sorry, but I have no other particular details about Dr. Hart because they weren't given there. I don't know what he's a PhD of. I don't know where he's from. He does use bib sources, though, and I recognize them because I'm familiar with some of the literature on that side of the issue, and I'll bring some others in so you'll see that I'm not really constructing a straw man here. I'm not misrepresenting the viewpoint. I want to represent it as fairly as possible, and then in a level-headed way ask ourselves the question, is this a sound, fair, reasonable interpretation of the texts as we have them? I will make my case, and my friends, you can decide for yourself which perspective is most reasonable given the texts. And I will say this, it occurs to me, and I will be arguing this way to some degree, that many of the interpretations that are offered to, in a sense, de-venomize, as some would consider, the text from its anti-homosexual sentiment, many of those interpretations are guilty of what I call bedtime story. Bedtime story is an apologetic tactic that I've identified. I didn't invent it, but I identified it. And basically it works like this. People tell a story about the text to put your argument to rest. A bedtime story. And the question I always ask about what I would call the bedtime story fallacy is that's an interesting story, but what does it have to do with the facts? And as these alternative explanations and interpretations come up, I would like you to ask the same question. Well, that's an interesting story, but what does it have to do with the facts of the text in question? Does the story really apply, or is it just merely a story to put an argument to rest? And we're going to go just to the main texts in the Scripture that I think are the most clear. There's no reason working with bad arguments. There are some arguments against homosexuality that have been offered from New Testament texts that I think can be compromised. So we won't bother with the marginal arguments. I'll just take what I believe are the most clear case examples. I'll concede the other ones. And those texts are in the book of Genesis, chapter 18, the book of Leviticus, and also in the book of Romans. And so let's turn to those passages. Genesis, chapter 18 and 19. The text starts in chapter 18, verse 16, and ends in 19:29. This, of course, is Sodom and Gomorrah. The text that I'm concerned with in particular starts in chapter 19, verse 4. Now, I'll be reading extensively from these texts and also from the notes that were handed out for two reasons. I don't want to just quote a verse or hammer a word and take just a simple microscopic perspective. I want to be fair as I possibly can, so that there may be people here that leave this morning that disagree with what Greg Koukl says, but they will not leave thinking that I misrepresented the viewpoint or I didn't deal with the whole text or I pulled things out of context. So I'll be starting in chapter 19, verse 4, and I'm reading from the New American Standard. The New American Standard Bible is the most precise translation, and though the New International Version is a good translation, there are times when you need the best, because precision is absolutely imperative. This is one of those times, and that's why I read from the New American Standard. Starting in verse 4 of Genesis chapter 19. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may have relations with them." But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they said, "Stand aside." Furthermore, they said, "This one came in as an alien. Already he's acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them." So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both great and small, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. Then the men said to Lot, "Whom else have you here? A son-in-law, and your sons and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The question in this text is, what was the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah? Let me read from Dr. Hart's handout. And I quote, "The key issue, why did God destroy the 2 cities? The common assumption is homosexuality. 3 other sound possibilities: the general wickedness mentioned in the previous chapter, attempted rape of the guests, and inhospitality. The last is biblical scholarship's generally preferred interpretation today. Please, I'll continue. I want to be careful here too, friends, because I don't want this to encourage derision of any kind. That's not what this is about. Sodom is used, he continues, as a symbol of evil in dozens of subsequent scripture references. And then he lists many of them. In none of these passages is homosexuality named as its sin. Inhospitality is, so are pride, greed, neglect of the poor. Englishman D. Sherwin Bailey argues the same way in Homosexuality in the Western Christian Tradition, as does John Boswell in Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. Incidentally, these 2 texts are key texts representing this particular point of view. They say that the men wanted to interrogate the visitors, ergo, we want to know them, yada, because they thought they were spies and they were concerned about the security of the city, so they just simply wanted to interrogate. Another possible view was that the sin was gang rape, not homosexuality per se. It was the rapacious act, not the inclination to homosexual desire, that God was offended by. In a broader sense, from this perspective, they were inhospitable.